Alrighty, Module 3B, we're still in Chapter 3 now, but we're getting to the middle part of Chapter 3. I'm going to focus on what the textbook author calls the British Empiricists, but I'll also add a couple more to the end of that too. So let's just jump right in. Ooh, here we are, British Empiricists plus. We're going to talk a lot about empiricism in this section. What is empiricism? Well, it's really going to be a contrast to rationalism. So we talked about rationalism with René Descartes. And just to remind you again, the idea behind rationalism is that you could get at the truth of something just by thinking things through in a very principled way. The empiricists say, no, that's not the way to get to truth. You get to truth through your senses. Okay, the truth is out there in the world, so to speak, and if you want to understand what it is, you have to engage with the world. Empiricism eventually is going to morph into what you and I think of today as your classic experiment, right? Where you test something by creating an experiment, but then of course you're going to collect data, right? And you're getting the data from the world. Right? And you go out and you get that data, and based on the data, you decide what you think is true or not. Okay, so experiments are the very formal approach or very formal aspect of empiricism. And in some cases, we almost nowadays combine those two things. So an empirical approach uses experiments as their tool to get at knowledge. But this was before experiments. And this is going to come out a few times. So at this point in time, people did not have control group, experimental group, and all the kind of stuff that you've learned about how to do a proper experiment. That did not really exist at that time. People were just kind of poking around. Like even Darwin, he was just playing with things in his garden and looking at how things related to one another. And so experiments don't exist in the common form. But we start to see a movement towards that with the empiricist approach. So who are these empiricists? Well, actually, before we get to the who are the empiricists, let's just make a really strong contrast here. So the rationalist approach is based on the notion that we can get to knowledge through reasoning, whereas the empiricists believe that experience is the source of knowledge. Interactions with the world is where you learn things. Rationalists really believe in a sort of intuition, a sort of follow your gut, figure stuff out. Empiricists don't like intuition. It's not about intuition, it's about what the data says, not about what you might think might make sense or not make sense. The data tells you what's true. Rationalism really endorses this notion of innate knowledge. Okay, that you already kind of have the knowledge back there. And so through a rational approach, you can kind of connect with it. Whereas empiricism says we don't have any innate knowledge. We're not born with knowledge of the world. We gain our knowledge of the world by interacting with the world. Okay, so very different positions here. I'll mention this, and I'll give you a COVID kind of vibe here, because we are now a very empiricist kind of science. We've become a very empiricist kind of science. And we talk about things like evidence-based, and we talk about how the data reigns, right? The data tells us what's true and what's not true. And so when you see, in the case of, say, environmentalism, you see scientists being doubted or questioned, or, especially in American politics, in this COVID case, we have the medical professionals that are saying, this is what the data says. And then we have politicians saying, yeah, but I'm not going to be reelected if I do that. And so, we're seeing them kind of at times challenge the scientific community. And its empirical approach to finding data. So you're seeing this at play all around, and those of us who believe in the scientific approach, are clinging on to this notion that no, the data wins. No, you have to believe what the science tells you. But we also see other people going, science. Here's what I think we should do. And so we see this playing out in front of our lives. Okay, so now let's dig into the history of this a little bit. We've kind of talked about what these two approaches are, but it was really a group of philosophers in England who were key in putting forth this notion of empiricism. This is going to be critical, by the way, to move us from philosophy to psychology. Because in a sense, psychology, the difference between those is psychology uses experiments to get at the truth. Philosophy still uses a much more rational approach, think things through, come up with thought experiments, etc. So it was really these early empiricists that started, creating the conditions that led to the birth of psychology, a science of the mind. Okay, so John Locke was one of the first ones. He liked introspection, by the way. So he's kind of this weird mix. He's not really full out empirical yet. He did like to kind of, look inside the mind as the mind was interacting with the world, so to speak, and try to figure out what was going on there. I only bring that up because you'll see when psychology is born, introspection is the original method, and it's been controversial throughout. So just to kind of mention that John Locke, kind of believed in introspection already before psychology. Now, this is an important aspect of Locke, the next one. He emphasized how associations could allow one to build complex ideas out of simple ideas. So, if you try to think of something like a house, this is an example they use in the textbook, the concept of a house. We have this concept, right? But Locke would say, well, yeah, but you could start much more easily. You could have concepts like wood and brick and glass. But if you configure wood and glass in the right way, then you get the concept of a window. And, now if you use brick for walls and windows in the walls, you're starting to work towards a house, right? You have to have a concept of a roof, you have to have a concept of stairs and doors and all those kinds of things. But you could have those simple, relatively simple things combined to be much more complex things. And then eventually you can get really complex concepts that are built out of simple little concepts. And so he thought associations could help us. So our notion of a house, maybe we came to it that way. We first had to learn simpler things, but we've learned to chain these simple things together to come up with really complex ideas. Ideas like Canadian. What does it mean to be Canadian? And so we can say there's a bunch of little simple things that when combined in the right way kind of define something as being Canadian. So we'd mentioned before that associations were, I think it was Aristotle, right, that highlighted associations and the importance they play. We see in Locke this adoption of that and this complexification of it. So take that idea of a simple association, but now let's show how we can use just connections between things as a way of representing even very complex ideas. Okay, you're going to see that both embraced and questioned, because one of the things with Locke is there's this implication that you start with simple and build and build and build and build to more complex. So it feels like a one-way street where we're building complex things out of simple things. But when we get to things like Gestalt psychology, you will see a bit of a pushback to say everything isn't all built out of little things. Sometimes that big thing is affecting how the little things are put together. So it'll get a little complex. It'll get a little sort of feedback loopy on us. Right now, it's not feedback loopy. It's very simple for Locke. Simple things build to more complex. Okay. Interestingly, Locke also thought a lot about rewards and punishments, and he had a lot of the ideas that we continue to believe today. So, for example, he said punishments were easy to do, and if there was something that your, say, child was doing that you didn't like, you could punish them for it. But the problem is, in his mind, that punishments also produce negative emotions, and those negative emotions become associated with the context of some sort. So he gives an example of children in school. And, let's say they're supposed to do their homework and they're supposed to have read something, and they come to school and they haven't read what they're supposed to read. And so they get punished for that. And by the way, back in these days, teachers would do things like hit you on the knuckles with rulers. It could be physical punishment. And what Locke would say is, well, if I got punished for not doing my reading, I might take some of that anger and frustration I felt at being punished, and I might associate it with reading. And so suddenly I might not like reading, right? And he says that's a great shame if a child could learn to associate reading with punishment and choose not to read, because there's so much great stuff that comes out of reading. So points I think that are critical here is he's already anticipating the importance of rewards and punishments in terms of shaping behavior. And of course, behaviorism will be all about that. So he's already highlighting that, and he's already sort of presaging some of the complexities that come around with respect to punishment, things we've done a lot of research on since and have shown him to be largely correct. His worries are borne out. But it's interesting that he's brought these issues up already. And then, of course, he's very well known for his notion of la tabula rasa. So the idea that we are born a blank slate, which is what la tabula rasa essentially translates to. So this is a direct confrontation to the notion of innate knowledge. He's saying you are born with no knowledge at all. You are born a blank slate. And then the experiences you have in life write your story, so to speak. So he is the ultimate nurture kind of person, which contrasted with this innate knowledge, which is a much more nature kind of view. And so he's directly taking that on. So once again, we're getting this push and pull between how much we're born with, what are genetic endowments, and how much do we learn along the way. And so he's really pulling towards that learning, the role of the environment, which is the empirical thing, right? Empiricists are interested in the world and how the world shapes us, and how we gain knowledge from the world. So that's not totally surprising. Okay, so that's John Locke. Again, let's keep a sense of where he is. He's 1630s, 1700s. A lot of what we've been talking about has been going on in these 1600s, 1700s idea. Another one of his contemporaries was George Berkeley. Berkeley was interesting because of his, it's almost sort of, is it going against some of the idea of complex ideas built out of simple ideas? He was certainly saying our systems are much more interactive, and that we learn to make inferences from experience. So once again, that empirical view that interactions with the world are shaping our knowledge. So here's a couple of examples from the textbook that I'll reiterate just to connect with you. So one of them, he says, is, okay, we're watching a car drive away from us. What's really happening on our retina is the amount of retina that car is sort of consuming starts out being really, really large because it's close to us. But as it goes away, it gets less and less and less and less and less in our retina. And what he says is, if everything else was true, what that should look like to us is that the car is shrinking. It shouldn't look like it's going away. It should just look like it's shrinking. Why does it look like it's going away? Well, he says, we have seen cars at different distances. And we know that a car further away looks like this, and a car closer up looks like that. And so from our experience with the world, from our memory, we have learned that as a given thing is further away from us, it looks smaller to us. And that learning has been brought back into the brain so that when this car is driving away from us, what makes the most sense to the brain is that it's driving away from us, not that the car is sitting there and shrinking. It hasn't seen that happen. But it has seen cars further away, and as they're further away, they're smaller. So again, important point here is we're getting a sort of interaction between memory, things we've learned from previous experiences with the world, and our current perception. And so it's much more complex. These things are combining to determine how we view things. Important points here. One, the environment interactions are what's governing this. So that's the empirical side of things. But the other thing is it's much more complex, right? So it is kind of going after that complex things are built out as simple, because it's suggesting, no, there's a way in which the past is affecting the present. Past memories are affecting current perceptions. And so it might be a more complicated system than one that just builds complex things out of little things. We maybe have to look for some of these complexities. He gives a couple of other examples, by the way. There's famous goggles, and sometimes back in the day in the meeting place, the police would have these goggles, and the police ones you'd put them on and they would displace everything, and it's supposed to make you feel like you would if you were drunk and trying to navigate. So they do things like ask you to walk around poles, and you're very kludgy because you're not seeing the world right. But if you keep those goggles on long enough, even if they're extreme, so there are some goggles that literally turn the world upside down, right? So the ceiling is on the roof for you now, and the roof is somewhere under your feet, which looks really weird at first. But the really powerful thing is that your brain figures it out. And if you keep those goggles on for a while, the world starts to look normal to you. The brain translates, and you're able to behave perfectly fine in this screwed up visual world. So all of these connections between memory and sensation and perception, and he was really interested in these interactions and how they all kind of fell out. He's also the famous tree falling guy. So what I mean by the tree falling guy, you know the expression, if a tree falls in the forest but no one is around to hear it, that's not quite right. Did it really fall? I'm getting this all wrong. But the idea that is just that he thought concepts came to life in our senses. So if we saw a tree fall, if somebody saw a tree fall, it existed in someone's mind, that experience, then the experience happened. But he says if a tree falls in the middle of the forest and nobody is around to see or hear it happen, then in a way he's saying it didn't happen, because he believed that the only real things were the things in our mind, the things that we sensed and perceived. And so that's what that quote is meant to kind of grab, is the importance. Like once a human senses it, then it's real. But if no human ever sensed it, then it's like it never happened, in a sense. Okay. The third of the so-called British empiricists, and sorry, I have my double espresso I have to have a sip of now. David Hume. I mean, these are all interesting people. These are all really deep thinkers. They mess with your head a little bit because they're philosophers, and philosophers just mess with your head a little bit. But here's a couple of things we'll talk about with David Hume. That's the highlight in the textbook, and that will come all through the course. Remember, at the time of David Hume, there were no formal experiments. And so what scientists typically did was they looked for what we would now call correlations or associations. They would sort of view the world and say, hey, if this is happening, then I often see that happening. And what David Hume says is that we're very quick to infer causation. So, let's say you have a garden and you go out on one day and you see something interesting. And then the next day you go out and where those interesting things were, something different has happened. And so you tend to think, oh, that first thing caused the second thing in time. And we can think that all sorts of strange ways. One of the other examples psychologists sometimes talk about is, have you ever been in an elevator and you press the button and it's not coming? And you're standing there and it's not coming. And so you feel the need to press the button again. And maybe even press it 2 or 3 times. And let's say it then opens. It feels to us like that second press opened it. We know it didn't. We know the first press caused the elevator, the one we did long ago. But if we press it and the door opens, it feels like that caused it. So David Hume says we're primed to see causation. But, he said, in fact, we never really know. All we know is that things are associated, that one thing occurs and then another thing occurs. But it doesn't mean the first thing caused the second thing. We never really know. At his time, that was a correct statement. We now think experiments allow us to get at causal relations and document them. But again, experiments didn't exist in that way. And so he said, we can never really get at causality, and that's what we really want to get at. So, it's kind of like, I don't know, a little bit of this skeptic kind of attitude. I don't think we're ever going to really figure things out. He also, by the way, he was a skeptic in a lot of ways. So he thought about the self. So, right back to René Descartes. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. David Hume said, well, I don't know about that. I think, well, I am. So I exist. And he said, well, whenever I try to think about me and I and the self, I don't get there. I just get a bunch of associations. Like maybe I think of things that I like, or things that I own, or people that I hang around with, or whatnot. But I don't really get self. He claims he could never sort of zoom in on the self, that all he ever got are associations with the self. And so he started to believe that the self couldn't be grasped. And this is really kind of getting at the heart of René Descartes. I'm going to start by the thing that I can't doubt. Well, David Hume's saying, I don't know, I kind of doubt that. And so, wow, right? So he's again in this skeptical tradition. He's putting challenges for people. Like, I don't know if you can ever do science right because of the causal thing, and I'm not even sure I believe what Descartes believes, is undoubtable. So he's one of those guys. Yeah. All right. But again, the important part of all three of these people is they certainly didn't believe in pre-existing knowledge, innate knowledge, and they certainly thought that our ability to learn about the world would only come about by interacting with the world, that's where the knowledge came from, and that's what makes them empiricists. Okay, so we're going to put them on hold for a second. I'm just going to talk about a couple of other characters in chapter 3 that are they're not technically part of the empiricist tradition. In fact, they're not really part of any tradition. Immanuel Kant might be. Mary Wollstonecraft. First of all, one of the really interesting things about Mary Wollstonecraft is she's the mother of Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley is the woman who wrote Frankenstein. And Frankenstein, just to kind of connect some of this stuff, think of Frankenstein. Frankenstein was a body made out of human parts that were sewn together, brought to life by electricity. Okay, we talked about Descartes, and we talked about how people were fascinated by the body and the body as a machine. That was all kind of in this era, right? We were starting to think of our bodies as machines, and the Frankenstein novel was really, the culmination of that. If we're all machines, we should be able to put parts of this machine together. And if we hit it with the right thing, what's the right thing? In Frankenstein's case, it was lightning, electricity. Well, we are electrical machines. We know that too. So if we hit it with the electricity, then maybe we could bring a machine that we built to life. Okay. And so I only mention that because this is her daughter, saying this. And this is the era, who wrote that book. And this is the era we're living in, where people are fascinated by the body and the connection between body and mind. Okay. Now, Mary herself didn't talk about that so much because at this time, 1700s, it's intriguing and powerful that she was able to publish things at all. This was not a time that where women were given the same opportunities as men were given in Western culture. Not at all. In fact, according to the textbook, most of the women at this time were given the jobs that involve sort of directly interacting with other human beings, often in a care kind of capacity. So school teachers, nurses, general healthcare providers of that sort. Anytime you need a nursing assistant in a science community, they might be in the labs, they might be cleaning up the lab equipment, goodness knows, doing the dirty work of the lab, but they were very seldom given the chance to sort of head up something. And so Mary Wollstonecraft had to kind of fight all those forces. And so it's not surprising that some of her struggle is reflected in her influence and where she ultimately had an impact. So, first of all, she was very much an advocate, and we continue to hear this today, for gender integrated and equal education. We hear this more from other parts of the world now, where, sometimes young girls are denied the same opportunity of education that's given to young boys. And there is this notion that many people believe that the best thing we can do for these young people is give them an education. We can empower them. And so she was very big on that. In her time, of course, it was females that in North America that weren't being given the same opportunities. She was arguing that if you could give women access to education, it would not defeminize them, which is what some men were arguing, that if we educate the women, we will defeminize them and they will lose their Yeah, I don't even want to use the words because they sound so so sort of despicable, but they'll lose their sort of delicateness and whatever that makes them a woman, and so we don't want to give them education. She said that was bullcrap, basically, that educated women would be more dignified, more graceful, and she even says something like, and they could be better wives, and an educated woman could be a better wife, as long as you, of course, do your husbandly things. So she, had a little rejoinder there as well. But those were the forces she was fighting at the time. And she fought through them and, really became an advocate for educating women. Also kind of interestingly, we think of women as more emotional and men as maybe more rational, or at least less emotional. It was certainly the case that the psychology up until this time was based a lot on reason and rationality, right? You've heard me talk about this quite a bit already, from Descartes onward. Previous Descartes as well. Not a lot of talk about emotions up until now. But Mary Wollstonecraft was the one that really said, hey, a big part of us is our emotional component. When I talk to media now, I say this is the bigger part of us. This is the primitive, strong, powerful part of us. So much of our behavior is reflecting our emotional situation at a time. We try to govern that a little bit with our rationality, but we're not very good at it. And so, I see the rational side is trying to harness the emotional side, which is strong and powerful. But psychology didn't even talk about it much before Mary Wollstonecraft came in. So she really highlighted the importance of emotion to human existence in general, and to reason, to adding the sensibility of reason. So you might say, oh, I shouldn't do that, because if I do that, it'll make this person feel bad. And that'll have negative repercussions towards my goals or whatever. And so you bring in the emotions as part of your reasoning to make it better. Okay. Third thing we're going to highlight, because it's going to show up regularly, and she's one of the first to ever do this. We almost call it now applied psychology, I guess, and it's largely what I do, I would argue. But the idea is, psychology need not just be some discipline that we're working away in the labs figuring stuff out. That we should perhaps try to find ways of making life better for humanity through what we learn. This could be a core role of what we have. So yeah, there's this idea of a utopian tradition, utopia being the perfect place. So can we use our knowledge of psychology to move society towards a more perfect way of being? I think less wars, less poverty, less whatever. So she was pushing that. She was saying we need to use this to better society. And there's a lot of people who have kind of taken up that banner, all the way to people like Skinner, who actually wrote a book, Walden 2, which was a utopian kind of book of how to use behavioral principles to make society better. I try to use the principles we've learned from education and package that into technologies so that hopefully people can make education better out there. And so this is what we now call applied psychology. And she was really the one that pushed that and started it. Okay, so one last character in this part of the story, and that is Immanuel Kant. Another philosopher. The book paints quite a funny story about Immanuel. Well, not a funny story, almost a COVID story. It's basically, he was born in one part, Kaliningrad, I believe. Never left the city, never traveled, didn't have any relationships of interest that most of people knew of. It seemed like he liked to think. And when he had a moment, he would sit in his study and think. And so a very strange character that did very little in an extroverted way or an outgoing way. He spent most of his quiet time thinking and potentially writing, in some cases writing. So, and no, by the way, we're just getting over the 1800s here as we do it. So here's some of the ideas that he came out with. So first of all, Immanuel Kant is the person who kind of described this idea of revolutions and changes in way of thinking, paradigm shifts, as we've called them earlier. So before we get to the second Copernican revolution, let's just talk about the first Copernican revolution here. So he was very impressed with with the effect that Copernicus's idea had and the path that Copernicus took. So what the way he tells it is as follows: that Copernicus was trying to understand the motion of the heavens, and he began with an Earth-centric view. And so he began by assuming the Earth was the middle of the universe, everything was moving around the Earth, and he tried to come up with Newtonian kind of formulas that would depict all the motions of the planets and the stars. But he couldn't make it work. He could predict quite a few of the motions with quite high accuracy, but there were always some things that just didn't make sense until he changed his core assumption. So instead of assuming the Earth is the center of the universe, he said, what if I assume the sun is the center of the universe and the Earth is revolving around the sun? Now, if I start there and think about the heavenly bodies and their motion with that as a beginning assumption, now things start to make sense. Now things fall into place. And so Copernicus was able to now predict things with better accuracy, but he also changed the way everybody thought of all of the stars. Like, he's changed the core assumption that everybody believed in, and that's what makes it a paradigm shift, right? So he had to put the whole crew of people interested in the stars had to transition to a different way of thinking. And so they suddenly saw everything differently in their field. So he was very impressed with that. I'll come back to the room full of puppies. I mentioned it before anyway, so you know what I'm thinking. So he thought, he was a big embracer of what he called the second Copernican revolution. And he wanted to say that our concepts, until him, the idea was we interact with the world, so we have the empiricist thing, and the information comes and ultimately forms a concept. So if we interact with a horse enough, let's say we see horses, maybe we get a chance to ride horses, we pet horses, whatever, all these interactions in the world eventually build in our mind a concept of the horse. Okay, that's the sort of simple view that a lot of people had. You interact with the environment and you learn what these concepts are about. And so that the concepts are a reflection of the experiences. The experiences produce the concepts. He said, not so fast. He wanted to do a Copernican thing and flip it. And, well, not flip it. Copernicus didn't really flip it, but he wants to flip it. He wants to say, no, what we see in the world is a function of what we believe. Our concept shapes our experience. So, room full of puppies. I mentioned this before. At UTSC, sometimes what we do at exam time is have a room full of dogs. And the idea is, if you're stressed out and if you like dogs, you can go into this room and get relaxed, right? But as I've mentioned to you before, there are many people in this world for whom the least relaxing thing they can imagine is a room full of dogs. They would find that quite anxious, and so that would make them anxious to be in a room full of dogs. So the point is, it's not about the dogs per se, it's the concept the person brings in. If they bring into this room the idea that the dogs are fluffy and cute and cuddly and lovable and warm, then when they go in there, that's what they'll see. They'll see a bunch of warm, fluffy, cuddly dogs, and they'll enjoy it. But if they go into that room thinking dogs are potentially dangerous and scary and whatnot, then when they go into that room, that's what they'll see with the dogs. So the concept they bring in is shaping the experience they have. Okay. So he starts talking about things that way, and sort of messing up people's idea about how knowledge is even gathered and how concepts and experience interact. Right. So part of this is this idea that the individual is constructing their experience. And they are part of the experience. Their views and things going into the experience. I'm going to give you a free ticket to the next Trump rally. Are you going to enjoy that or not? Well, that depends more on you than on the Trump rally and what you believe going in. And if you think he's a big idiot, you're not going to enjoy that rally at all. If you think he's the best thing in the world, that's going to be a lot of fun for you. It's the same event. It's about you sort of shaping what that experience is for you. Okay. He really believed that So following Pythagoras, following then Newton, he bought into this idea that so many people do, that the ultimate science is one that can describe things mathematically. When you can get to that mathematical level description, you really understand something. And he felt psychology might never get there. He said, the external world, the world of physics and chemistry, things are oriented in terms of space. How far away from us are they, and how close are they to each other, and all these things that he thought math could handle really, really well. But he said our internal experience only proceeds with time. Things are in our mind, and then they go away, and something else is in our mind. It goes away, and something else is in our mind. So the changes are happening over time. And he didn't think that was well suited to a mathematical description, that we might never be able to come up with an organized mathematical description of the mind, given its temporal nature. It's not like, Pythagoras had geography to work with, right? Space, measures. And so he thought it was going to be a challenge for psychology to ever get to that mathematical description. He didn't rule it out. He said, maybe there's a form of psychology that I don't know right now that would fit this, but the psychology that he knew, or the science of the mind, I should say, because it wasn't called psychology, but the science of the mind that he knew, he didn't think would fit with a mathematical description. So he kind of shot that down. We're going to see that go back and forth throughout this course. Ixian's wheel, mathematics stuff. Yeah, cool. All right, so that's my second lecture for this module. I'm going to have a third lecture on chapter 3, just mostly focusing on Darwin, and then we'll be on to chapter 4. Okay. Later, guys.